Okay, so here we are, video lecture for Introduction to Political Thought. Hopefully this will make you a little more connected, and maybe even more than that, you're feeling you want a little bit more information about the paper that's due next week. So we'll focus on Locke in this lecture, okay? Let's go back to Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan. What did he say about government? In some ways very different from Locke, and seems very different to us because we are, in many ways Lockeans. We're so used to so many of Locke's ideas, whether we fully accept them or believe them or not. That's so much the basis of American politics and so much of American society, our basic assumptions about the way that the world works. Then when we go back and look at Hobbes and we see that, he was talking about things like, the need to have a sovereign, the reason why monarchy was better than democracy, it sounds obviously very authoritarian and very repressive. But remember, all of that is based for Hobbes on the notion of natural rights. We have one fundamental natural right, which is the most important thing for Hobbes, and that is the right to life. Okay, and he thinks that from that right to life, we then have an obligation as well to stay alive, though. Okay, so everything comes back to this basic idea of a natural right to life. And remember, in that dedicatory letter, which I don't think was in your reading in the reader, but we kind of read and talked about some in class, he says there's this huge debate happening right now in British society. He says, I'm going to try to pass down the middle. And he says, I'm probably going to be attacked by both. He anticipates that Leviathan will be a very controversial book. And why is that? Because he says there's this huge debate, there's this huge, but it's more than just a debate. I mean, there had been civil war, there was real anxiety and tension and violence over it. And what was that? He said, well, on the one hand, you have those who contend, he thinks, for too much liberty, and on the other hand, those who contend for what he calls too much authority. And he says, neither one is, I'm going to try to, again, pass down the middle, so he's not really on either side. Why not? Because basically what he's going to argue for is that the government, the civil powers, he puts it, should have a great deal of power and authority, but not for the reasons that were common in society at the time, not for the reason that the proponents of the king were really giving, namely that we have some sort of duty or obligation or sense of obedience to the monarch, to the crown, okay? For Hobbes, again, it comes back to that right, that fundamental natural right, okay? And we talked a little bit before the break about how you can see with Hobbes the birth of what we sometimes call the bourgeoisie, the middle class, okay? For Hobbes, or the Hobbesian individual, the Hobbesian human being, the person who has really read Hobbes and really absorbed it, or maybe didn't need to, maybe already felt that way or thought that way, but for the person who has really read Hobbes and really absorbed it, who really has a Hobbesian outlook on life, what are they like? Well, they're fundamentally unheroic, right? Hobbes acknowledges that heroism, bravery, courage, aggression, all of these things are real, but he thinks that they're incredibly destructive and stupid, and that they should be kind of tamped down. Okay, so they're not heroic. What they want, what they seek, is they're afraid of dying, especially dying violently, especially dying suddenly. But then some of the other motivations they have, as he puts it in chapter 13, desire for commodious living. They want comfort. When you're in the state of nature, the thing that your overwhelming concern is fear of death. But what makes you get out of the Hobbesian state of nature? According to Hobbes, why do you move from anarchy to government? In the first place, security is the first thing that you want. But then you also want, again, what he calls commodious living. You realize, we could actually, if we cooperated, we could have a more comfortable life, a more secure life, but also it would just be easier if we had beds in houses rather than sleeping in caves. We'd booby trapped with, weird, we've tied a stake to a sapling that's going to get somebody if they come in. More detail than I need here on that. But so for Hobbes, it's security, and then it's commodity, it's comfort, and then there's a certain amount of, although he sees that there's this heroism, there's courage, there's aggression for honor, which he thinks is bad when it takes a violent, overly aggressive form. There is a certain the Hobbesian person, the bourgeoisie, is self-regarding. There's a lot of concern for reputation. There's a lot of concern for things like that. But again, in a fairly sort of, for lack of a better word, a petty, unheroic, kind of very watered down way. So again, you think about, kind of the middle class, concern with security, obviously. The notion that you would fight a duel over honor is just bizarre to them, right? Concern with comfort, and some concern for reputation, but in a relatively moderate way, right? They're not actually going to become, they're not going to risk very much over a sense of honor or a sense of pride or something like that. Okay, and Locke kind of builds, you can see how Lockean man is somewhat like that, although he's a little bit more industrious and a little bit more acquisitive, you might say. Okay, so we have Hobbes, right, and Locke is very clear. I'm not a Hobbesian. At different points he says this. So what does he say instead? Okay, for Hobbes, state of nature, it's terrible, it's hell on earth, it's everybody's fighting all the time. They're driven, as he puts it, three major causes. First of all, fear. Everybody is a potential enemy. Even if you're not threatening me today, you could be tomorrow. And then competition over scarce resources, and then glory. And again, glory is the one that he thinks actually there are some people, maybe not everybody, but there are people who are motivated, as he puts it, they will fight to the death over things like a word, a look, a smile. And he kind of doesn't like these people. He's contemptuous. He's trying to convince everybody else to be that way. Okay, but that's what really happens in the state of nature for Hobbes. So we want to get out of it, and then we want to create a government and give that government as much power as possible, because that's what we need. We need to be secure, and also he's confident that a monarchy, a properly governed monarchy, and he has all those arguments for why monarchy will be better governed than a democracy, that a properly governed monarchy will provide us with a relatively secure and, again, comfortable life, okay? With Locke, it's a little bit different, okay? So state of nature, remember, again, we talked about all this before the break, so I'm gonna simplify a lot with Locke in some ways, okay? State of nature, we're out there, it's not nearly as violent, it's not nearly as frightening, it's not nearly as chaotic or hellish as Hobbes' version is, okay? Locke says in the state of nature, we have reason. We're not the kind of psychotics that Hobbes thinks that we are. As Locke puts it, just because I have a right to something I need to survive, obviously doesn't mean that I have a right to everything. And in the state of nature, I could see that. I could see that when I pick an apple from the tree to keep myself alive because I'm hungry, I realize I don't have a right to go and enslave somebody else to pick the apples for me. I mean, that's obvious, right? Just like we can see it really simply. I need what I need to survive and have a right to what I need to survive doesn't mean I have a right to everything, including, for instance, the freedom or the labor of other people. And Locke says that's relatively clear in the state of nature. Again, the question arises, well, why do we want out of it then? So it does become bad enough, he says, but state of nature, I have a right to life. And as Locke says, and really, kind of develops, and again, this probably seems obvious to us, but I think it's a pretty convincing argument. Without liberty, without freedom, what does it mean to say we have a right to life? We don't really have much of an opportunity to protect ourselves if we're held as a slave by somebody else. If we're in a prison and they can come in and kill us whenever they want, in what sense do we have a right to life? We're really just hoping that they won't do that. So he says, saying that you have a right to life is meaningless without saying you have a right to liberty or to freedom. And he says, then on top of that, you also have a right to property. And in the simplest, and again, I'm going to simplify a lot here. We talked about this in some detail before the break. So just to make this easy and relatively quick for you, Locke says, what does it mean to say we have a right to property? Well, since I have freedom and I have the right to my own body, remember Hobbes says in the state of nature, you don't even have a right to your own body. You don't have a right to anything. I mean, somebody can come and they can take you and they can enslave you, they can kill you, they can use your body if they want to for what, if they can. It's a horrible nightmare situation. Locke says, I have a right to my own body, therefore I have a right to the product of my physical labor. Simple examples in the state of nature, I pick an apple from a tree, I eat it, I have a right to do that, right? And he says, you don't have to go and check with everybody else in the world, can I eat this apple? Because it's common sense, you would die before that could happen. I'll give one more example and then I'll talk about that a little bit more. Also, he says, if I sharpen a stick and I stab a fish in the stream with it, I have a right to that fish, right? I've mixed my labor with nature and I've come away with that fish. Okay? He says, you don't have to ask permission for everybody else, even though originally nature was in common, because he says, you would starve to death. And also, there's a natural limit to how much you can take. You're not going to take all the apples and let them rot. Let's say you're living in a cave in the state of nature. You're not going to drag all the apples back to your cave and let it sit around and be surrounded by rotting apples. You're even less likely to do that probably with fish. You're not going to spear all the fish in the stream and then take them back to your cave and sit around surrounded by rotting fish and say, look at me, I'm a state of nature tycoon here with all this dead fish. So he says there's a natural limit to it. Nature puts a limit on what you're actually going to do and what you would reasonably want to do in terms of acquisition in the state of nature. So he says there's that natural limit, and then there's that limit that nature gives us. And then as Locke goes on and develops this, he says, but the thing is, those limits, nature doesn't give us very much on its own. And again, at first he sort of, because that was kind of the traditional Christian view, was God has given us nature in common, and nature basically provides for us. Obviously, people were aware of famines and droughts and things like that, but they were like, basically we should treat nature as a common thing that's given to us by God, and we are stewards. We talked about this one before the break, that we're basically taking care of it for future generations. We're taking what we need right now, obviously, to stay alive, but we also have a responsibility, first of all, to everybody now, because no one has that strong of a claim to individual property, and we also need to take care of it for future generations. Again, this was the theory, at least, may not have always been exactly like that in practice, but that was kind of the idea. Locke wants to change even the theory. So Locke says, and again, he's careful. At first he says, yeah, it's right there in the Bible. God has given all things richly. But as he goes on in that chapter on property, he kind of basically, the argument for individual property, the argument for private property, yeah, in the state of nature, you can take what you need to survive. You can pick the apple. You can spear the fish or kill the deer and eat its meat. But how do we get then to a situation where people claim actual tracts of land? How do they say this field is mine? Well, Locke says, when you fence off a field and you plow it and you cultivate wheat or corn or whatever, and you grow that, you're producing far more from that, let's say, 1 square acre of land than nature would ever produce. And as he goes through that chapter on property, nature becomes more and more, it becomes, when you cultivate land, you get 10 times, you get 100 times, you get 1,000 times what you would get if it were wild nature. So he says, when you cultivate the land, when you actually kind of say fence off an area of land and cultivate it and grow crops, let's just say corn, you're producing 10, 100, 1,000 times more corn than that land would produce on its own. So he says, we're no longer in the state of nature, and it's true. At that point, you're taking that 1 square acre of land, and people don't have access to it anymore. You're putting up a fence, you're claiming it as your own, but you're justified in doing that because you're producing far more food for everybody than it would be than that land would ever produce if you left it by itself. So yes, you benefit because you are going to get paid for this corn. We'll get to that in a second. But you are also benefiting everybody else. So there's sort of a common good argument in a way for the idea of private ownership, which again wouldn't have been that radical by itself. Okay, but the other thing that Locke says is that's where you need money to come in. Because why would you do that? Maybe if you're really public spirited, maybe it would be nice if people fenced off the land and did that. But Locke is saying, like, no, actually, it's going to be a little bit more. And he doesn't quite say greed, but he says, what's the motivation going to be? And he says, what happens is at one point you get the emergence, the creation of money. Okay, so you can only, again, okay, so remember in Plato's Republic, that first city that Socrates and Adeimantus found, everybody does one job and they take the products of that job and they give it in common to the city. So if you're a farmer, you grow your corn or whatever, and you put the corn in common for the city, or the wheat or whatever. Maybe the baker makes the wheat into bread, and meanwhile you get clothes and a house in return. But that's not quite what Locke has in mind. He says, why would you do that? And he doesn't necessarily think that people are going to be that public spirited. Instead, he says, well, you would do it in part because of some kind of profit. So he says, as you start to collect money, I mean, again, maybe there's a little bit of, well, I'm gonna have a little garden, and I'm gonna take the corn or the wheat that I grow, and I'm gonna trade it with people. But again, you're still at a relatively limited area, a relatively limited level of development, according to Locke, and probably according to most people, right? You have a little bit of land there, you're gonna grow a little bit of crops, and you're gonna trade with other people. But he says, where it really takes off is when you have money, when you take something that you use as a symbol of value, and he says, a shiny piece of metal, a seashell, whatever, and you can store that forever. Unlike food, and even certain kinds of clothing, you can store money forever. You can just store it up forever. So at that point, it says, well, why don't I, fence off 5 acres of land and grow all this corn and sell it to everybody? Because now that we're using money, that makes sense. I can become wealthy. I can stockpile all of this money. And now, therefore, acquisition of money becomes an important motive for Locke, and one that Locke is pretty much good with. He says, again, the government exists to protect your right to property. He doesn't necessarily mean that, picking an apple in the state of nature. He means acquiring all of that. And his argument is, and again, it's kind of a very simplifying a lot here, but it's fine. Intro class, you got papers coming up. We don't need to get into all the details of that, chapter 5 on property. But really simply, he says basically, it's kind of, as we sometimes say today, a rising tide lifts all boats. Locke, what is the justification for this? Well, everybody benefits. Everybody's going to have a better quality of life, at least measured in material terms. Okay, so if we go back to that example we kind of talked about in class, you imagine an island. Let's say the island has 10 square feet, 10 square miles, and somebody claims, all of that except for one little common area. Okay, three people claim most of it. And they're going to produce corn, and they're going to produce, maybe some of them produce livestock, maybe some of them grow some sheep or raise some sheep and shear them and make clothes out of what they're doing, okay? So what is the justification for these three people claiming 90% of the property on the land? Because obviously everybody else on the island, they can't walk in this person's field now. They can't take food, but they also just can't move around, right? In a way, private property is somewhat restrictive. It says you can't go here. Not only can you not take the fruits of this field, but you can't, and also again, obviously you can't come in and say, actually, I'm going to cultivate this field now. Well, someone else has claimed it. What's the justification for that? Locke says, well, everybody's going to have more. They're going to have more corn. They're going to have more wheat. They're going to have more pigs or sheep to eat. They're going to have more clothing. And so although the other people on the island might effectively have to work for the people who have claimed the land, they may have to work as laborers on the farm or, taking care of the sheep or the pigs or whatever. They're going to have a better quality of life overall, so it's justified. You're going to have inequality, and you're going to have some people who have the land and control in some ways and other people who don't. But Locke says everybody's going to be better off. And he says a day laborer in England is better clothed and eats better and so on than, royalty in other parts of the world, especially he thinks North America. Now we'll see Rousseau fundamentally disagrees with that, okay? Rousseau thinks that's not true, actually. If you were on that island, you actually having to be dependent on someone else to live the way that you have to on this Lockean scheme is the worst thing imaginable. You would much rather live on an island that was totally uncultivated, but where you were totally free to roam wherever you wanted to and do whatever you wanted to, even if it meant that you had less to eat. And even if it meant that you had to sleep outside and you didn't have, pork chops and a warm bed and all these other things, Rousseau says, well, no, because freedom is far more important than any of that stuff. And once you pass over into a society where private property, not just this person owns this or has a tool or something, but where all the land is taken up, and now everybody is reliant on the landowners just to survive. If it comes down to it, whoever owns the land owns the food supply, and therefore the other people are fundamentally dependent on them just to stay alive. Now that natural freedom that we had, that Locke agrees and thinks we had too, Rousseau says that's gone, and that's the worst loss we can imagine. Nothing justifies it. Certainly not, a little bit of more food or better clothing, which again, as Rousseau points out, it's not even better. I mean, you would much rather wear, an animal skin in the rain than you would a cotton jacket or something. I mean, the ways that people dressed in Europe weren't even necessarily better than the way that people in other parts of the world with less hierarchical governments, with less private property and so on, with less of a kind of developed economy are living. So Rousseau kind of denies that actually that people are better off in some ways. But more fundamentally, he's like, look, let's say that were true. Okay, let's just say that people are eating better and they're better clothed in England. They're not, but let's just say that they are. Who cares? As Rousseau says, if we can't imagine giving that up for the sake of natural freedom, it's only because we're slaves. We're so far removed from the real natural way that things are. And remember, as we talked about throughout the class, beginning with Socrates and Plato, nature is sort of good. Let's find out what's natural and live that way. Whether it's nature in Plato, or whether it's natural law in Cicero and Aquinas, or wherever it is, we're looking for what is naturally the way that things are. And Rousseau continues that. And he says, look, by nature, we want to be free, and it doesn't matter what we get in terms of better material standard of living, it's not worth giving up our natural freedom. So Rousseau fundamentally disagrees with Locke in that way. And in some ways you have, ever since then, you've had this kind of disagreement in modern thought. I mean, not instantly, but somewhat developed. A few years ago, I'm kind of dating myself, it's been more than a few years now. But when I was younger, a guy named Benjamin Barber wrote a book called Jihad versus McWorld. And this was even before September 11th. But the idea was you have that the modern world is being divided into these two major forces. One is, he called jihad. Again, this was before September 11th, before some of these wars. I mean, it was a less charged term or word at that point. But the idea was people who cling to some kind of particular local identity. Okay, people who don't necessarily who cling to their traditions, to the way that things are done in their society, and on the other hand, you have what he called McWorld, the kind of homogenizing force of global capitalism. Okay, everywhere in the world you go, there's a McDonald's. Obviously, that's where McWorld comes from. But there's also a Starbucks. There's an Apple store. There's, I don't know, Calvin Klein or the Gap or whatever. Increasingly, everybody's watching American movies, but as China becomes more of a economic power, those movies are being changed to somewhat to make sure that they can be shown in China as well, and make all the money that way. So they're being flattened out even more, and things that maybe were somewhat distinctively American are now being removed so that they can appeal to as many people as possible in this global economy, which is kind of dictated by particular locations where particular mores and particular beliefs and so on are particularly strong. But there's still this sense of homogeneity. Everybody's the same. Capitalism is making everybody the same. This kind of market, the idea that you would kind of try to opt out of that seems strange to people. Why would you again, as law in kind of the Lockean view, why would you want to have less economic development when you could have more? Okay, so you're eating McDonald's instead of whatever your traditional social thing, your traditional cultural cuisine was, but you have more money. Everybody has more money. Your stock market is you have a stock market now. It's better, etc. Rousseau obviously would say none of that is worth anything, though. I mean, Rousseau, he does get into some of these things, the traditional things like that. He's not super focused on that, but he would probably be more in this stream of thought, and it does in some ways trace its beliefs back to him. What you want is freedom, and part of the way that freedom expresses itself, in the state of nature, but we're not in the state of nature anymore. And as you know, and as we'll see, Rousseau, he's very intensely aware that we've left the state of nature and that that's over. So part of the way that we create meaning for our lives, again, this is more kind of post-Rousseau, but in his tradition, is through culture, is through tradition, is through history. So the idea, if you have a choice between kind of a higher standard of material living, but having to buy into this very homogenized, very blank, very kind of boring, bloodless, soulless world of common commerce, or you can have this tradition and you can have this kind of, which is limited and might be unjust in some ways and might be obviously less economic growth and less material standard of living. Rousseau would probably say, well, let's go with the more traditional, where our lives at least are given meaning by something other than the pursuit of money and the pursuit of profit and things like that. Okay, so this is a distinction and a tension and a disagreement that continues right up to today. It's still an important part of disagreements and tension and uncertainty in the world generally, and even in political philosophy and so on. Okay. So I hope that explains some of the basic stuff about Locke. The other major thing are the selections from the letter concerning toleration. And again, really simplify this. Toleration, massive thing. I mean, you saw with Spinoza, or you kind of saw with Spinoza, we talked about a little bit. He says we have a natural right to freedom of conscience as well. Locke, you see it, he talks about the letter concerning toleration. And there are kind of two major parts of this, both really developed by Jefferson, just like a lot of Locke's other ideas. But kind of when it comes to religious freedom, what's that about? There are kind of a couple of different things. Okay, one of them is, as he says relatively quickly, government exists again, as we know. Actually, let me stop and back up. Of course, for Locke, also we have a right to revolution. That government exists to secure the rights of the governed, and therefore the governed have a right to go and overthrow the government if their rights are really being trampled on. If they're really being threatened, if government exists just to secure those rights, and instead government is actively repressing them, destroying them, then Locke says, of course we have the right to rise up and to overthrow that government. And again, that's the idea of government as a contract. It's a contract between selfish individuals. When we don't like the contract anymore, when we're not getting what we contracted for, we have a right to dissolve the contract unilaterally if need be. So the idea of government exists to secure the rights of the governed, and when it's not doing that, and when it's in fact threatening those rights, damaging them, taking them away, the people absolutely have the right to rise up and to overthrow the government and to create a new one that better serves the purpose of the sole purpose of any legitimate government, which is to protect the rights of the governed. Okay, again, this is really directly said very clearly in the Declaration of Independence. And again, to us as Americans, that probably seems, I mean, it's probably just self-evident, right? I mean, of course you can overthrow the government if it's threatening your rights. I mean, of course people have the right to do that. Of course government exists to serve the people, not the reverse. But in Locke's day, this was really pretty revolutionary. In Jefferson's day, the idea that government was something that the people could just take or leave, again, not for, as Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence, you're not going to do it over trivial causes, obviously. But when there's a clear, studied design, a clear intention here to take away people's rights, people absolutely have the right to overthrow the government, okay? And this, again, probably seems self-evident to us, probably seems like it's barely even worth mentioning, just obvious that that's the way that it is, but it wasn't at the time. It was the idea that people have the right to change the government was, no pun intended, quite revolutionary. This was not really something that people thought very often, traditionally, and this just was not the view, okay? So again, it probably seems obvious to us, relatively radical thing that Locke introduced, okay? And now we'll go back and finish up here with the letter concerning toleration. Basic idea, the people have the right to, there's some measure. I mean, Locke was, for us today, Locke's views about toleration were still fairly conservative. I mean, he was not as open, he was not as comfortable with people having the full range of rights of belief, and in particular public expression of belief that we would probably tend to think in the United States in 2020. But the basic idea is, he says, government doesn't exist to tell people what to think. It doesn't exist to govern people's beliefs. It exists to govern the physical world, basically. It exists to take care of their material needs. First of all, it exists to take care of their physical safety. And then it also exists to govern, again, property, material questions, okay? And of course, this, again, Jefferson does a great job of this, puts it very succinctly in Notes on the State of Virginia. He says, the legitimate powers of a government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So there it is. What is the legitimate purpose of government? Make sure that no one is picking your pocket or breaking your leg. When it comes to religious belief and what people are publicly professing even, that doesn't harm you, Jefferson says. And Locke, a little bit less liberal or kind of anything goes than Jefferson, but Locke basically is agreeing, okay? Government exists to do this, and also you can't manage people. Government can't touch people's conscience. It can't touch their mind anyways. So on the one hand, you have this sort of somewhat more low-minded sort of, hey, government just exists to take care of physical needs, physical safety and property. That's really all the government is concerned about, and it doesn't hurt me to hear these things about 20 gods or no God. That doesn't matter. On the other hand, you have this view, as Jefferson says, we can't give up our freedom of conscience. We can't give up our rights of conscience, as he says also in Notes on the State of Virginia. Our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted, could never submit. We are answerable for them to our God. So again, the idea there, freedom of conscience is a fundamental natural right, and one that we can never give up to the government. We have to decide for ourselves what we think is true. So there's this kind of low-minded or kind of a little bit less heroic, a little bit less impressive version where it's just like, government just exists to make sure no one is robbing you or threatening your physical safety or cheating you. Maybe government should regulate marketing or something like that. Beyond that, it doesn't matter. Let people believe whatever they want. It's not taking any money from you. It's not physically harming you. Who cares? On the other hand, you have this view where it's like, well, actually we have this freedom of conscience. We have to believe for ourselves. We have to decide for ourselves what we think is true. Government cannot do that, and it shouldn't, of course, as Jefferson also says in Notes on the State of Virginia. Constraint may make someone worse by making him a hypocrite, but it will never make him a truer man. It may fix him obstinately in his errors, but will not cure them. So again, he says, look, what can constraint really do? Can you force somebody to change their mind by stopping them from saying something, by requiring them to profess a particular religion? No, you can force them to do that if they don't want to be fined or tortured or even executed, but you're not really changing what they believe. If anything, you're making them a worse person. You're making them a hypocrite. You're making them profess something that they don't actually believe because of some other issue. And then there's also the question or the problem, which again Locke gets into a little bit, Jefferson talks about. In fact, you're corrupting the church. You're basically bringing hypocrites into the church. You're making people profess a religion that they don't really believe, and even a kind of more, even if you're not using coercion or threats of persecution, if people don't profess something, if you're just saying, hey, you have to be a member of the Church of England in order to have a government position or in order to have certain advantages in society, people are going to convert then for all the wrong reasons. So you're going to have a church full of hypocrites who are joining for worldly success and for worldly advantage, not because they believe anything. Okay? And again, here we have some really fundamental Enlightenment ideas. Okay? The idea that, and I'm going to quote Jefferson again because he says it about as well as you can. So, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal, to the test of their investigation. They are the natural enemies of error and of error only. Reason and experiment have been indulged in some states in the colonies, and error has fled before them. It is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. And as he says elsewhere, truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. Errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. Okay, so there's really kind of fundamental Enlightenment idea. First of all, that people can figure things out. That if you let people debate, they will be able to arrive at the truth. People question that, especially today with the internet, with certain things that are developing in terms of communication. People certainly question that, but you could kind of, is that true? Can people basically figure out the truth or not? I mean, that's not, it's a fundamental principle of Enlightenment belief. Is it quite as obvious or is it quite as true? That's for you to decide. The other thing here is there is some question about, well, does constraint, does it just make you a hypocrite? Does suppressing certain ideas, does even forcing people to profess certain things, again, are people a little bit, this is kind of this Enlightenment view of people as just individuals who step back, who consider arguments and arrive at the truth on their own? Does some kind of, is there actually more of a physical component to that than people like Locke or Jefferson might have thought? Are going through certain practices, are being constrained in certain ways, does that actually have something to do with your, and likewise, does the influence of things that a more permissive society is going to allow you to do, are you more likely to arrive at certain conclusions if you're under the influence of, other non-rational, non-intellectual things that you realize, hey, this fits a lot better if I believe this in this way? Open questions, but certainly these are some of the ideas that are fundamental, that when people, if you go back in history and you say, well, why did certain people disagree with toleration? Because again, this was pretty new at the time. Certainly Socrates didn't think, we remember from the Apology and from parts of the Republic, Socrates didn't think people should be able to say whatever they wanted to, or at least he was willing to question that, to advance arguments that people shouldn't. Obviously, a lot of important ancient and medieval thinkers did not believe in absolute toleration or freedom of speech, or even, not even absolute, but, the line, the kind of circumference of what you could reasonably say in public was relatively small for millennia, or centuries, let's say. For centuries, why was that? What did they think? Well, part of it was they questioned whether people could come to it, but they also questioned, again, Aristotle, you need the moral virtues to have the physical, to have the intellectual virtues. If you're not courageous, if you're not moderate, if you're not just, you're not going to be able to think very well, actually. So it's not, and if people don't have the moral virtues, and the moral virtues, remember, for Aristotle, are in part a product of habit. So a society in which just anything goes and people will figure out the truth on their own, Aristotle would not agree with that. He would not agree that where people just live however they want to, that they can just kind of detach their reason from their moral selves. And again, the moral nature is in part a product of habit, and certainly can be, it certainly helps if certain things are forbidden. So again, this is kind of Locke's view. Fundamental, very, very influential, probably a fundamental part of the way that almost all of us see the world. But these would be sort of some of the earlier questions about that. Is it really, first of all, can people arrive at the truth on their own? And do people really think about it in such an abstract way? Or are these other parts of life an important part of arriving at the truth? And therefore, do they need to be more governed? And do we need, again, to kind of say, listen, maybe there's going to be a little bit more regulation, including of speech and things like that? Okay, so hope that that was helpful. If you have questions, if you're having issues with anything but the class, with obviously we've changed formats, we've changed a lot of things here, email me or use that link I created in the Blackboard page, okay? And let me know if you have any issues. If not, we're going to get through this, okay? Just a couple more weeks. So hope that this was helpful, and I will talk to you all soon.